This is Democracy Watch. I'm joined here by my co-host, voting rights attorney and founder of Democracy Docket, a news outlet focused on voting and elections, Marc Elias. So Marc, last week we spoke about the big Supreme Court decision that'll lead to another minority-majority congressional district in Alabama. What impact will that have in Georgia? What do you expect to see there?
So I think you're going to see another minority opportunity district in Georgia as well. At the same time, roughly, that my law firm filed the lawsuit in Alabama that we talked about, they also filed a lawsuit in Louisiana and also in Georgia. And that Georgia case has gone pretty well towards showing that there needs to be an additional minority opportunity district there. The judge has asked for some further briefing, but I would expect by the end of the summer, you'll see a favorable ruling there as well.
Okay, so specifically, how will this process play out? Like, because of this ruling, Alabama is going to have to redraw their maps. And so does someone have to sue for redrawn maps, or you, I guess, have to sue for redrawn maps in every respective state? Like, will you have to sue for redrawn maps in Georgia and then Louisiana and then Texas? Or will this kind of thing just happen automatically by virtue of the decision in that Alabama case?
Yeah, so my firm filed lawsuits, like I said, within a relatively short time frame in Alabama, Louisiana, Georgia, and Texas. So those four cases already exist, right? Two of them were already before the U.S. Supreme Court, Alabama and Louisiana. The Supreme Court decided the Alabama case. That effectively decides the Louisiana case. So those two cases will now go back to the trial courts, and the trial courts will say, hey, Republican legislature, you have to draw a second majority-minority district. If the legislature doesn't do it or tries to play games, the court will then appoint a special master and adopt their own map. So that's sort of one thing. In Georgia, the case is still ongoing. The trial court had not issued a final ruling. I think that trial court's going to issue a final ruling and again order Georgia to create another majority-minority district in the Atlanta area. And if it doesn't, same thing, the court will do so itself. Texas a little bit further behind just because there's such a big state and there's so many districts at play, but that will repeat itself out, but probably over a longer period than the other three.
While the Georgia and Texas cases are ongoing and you have this decision handed down by the Supreme Court, does that immediately impact what's happening in Georgia or Texas? Or do those cases keep moving forward through the trial court completely independent of what happened in the Supreme Court?
So they keep moving forward. I don't think it's fair to say they're independent because the judges read what the Supreme Court wrote. And, I think that what you had in the 2021 redraws in a lot of these states were Republican legislatures predicting that the Supreme Court was going to cut back Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So they were sort of cheating on the maps they were drawing. Now they've gotten caught. We sued. We thought they were wrong. Now they've gotten caught, and the Supreme Court's not going to bail them out. So I think that those cases will now move forward, I think, in a favorable way. The question is how much the Republican legislatures want to fight over it versus make the best of the reality of the situation they're in.
And just sticking with this for one more moment, if you have a decision passed down that's not favorable to creating an opportunity district in Georgia or Texas, and you have that decision that was handed down in the Supreme Court, does it make it that much easier to appeal and to immediately point to or directly point to what happened in the Supreme Court to be able to get a more favorable ruling in the appeal?
Yeah, I think that obviously the way in which the Supreme Court ruled in the Alabama case, which was to basically say, look, we've had this standard since the mid-1980s, and that standard is still the same, and it has not been pared back or curtailed or somehow disfavored in the intervening decades. I think that is going to be a very, very solid precedent to point courts to about how they have to do the right thing by minority voters. And if state legislatures try to play games, I think they're going to find the courts pretty intolerant of delay and obfuscation.
Okay. So I want to stick with Georgia for a moment. We'll make this a whole Georgia-centric episode, but
love Georgia.
We obviously are looking toward Fulton County for the next impending indictment now. So if we do see an indictment from Fulton County, the former president would be facing direct legal consequences for his conduct following the 2020 election. What would that unprecedented charge mean for our democracy and our elections moving forward?
So in some ways, I actually think the Fulton County case is the most important case for our democracy. You know, the New York case, important to hold the president accountable, was really a campaign finance case, or is a campaign finance case. The case in Florida, very important case for national security, but it's a national security documents case. A DC case would be vitally important because it would get to the people who masterminded the efforts that led to January 6th. But in many respects, you don't wind up with January 6th and what happens if you don't have the repeated assaults on democracy in state courts all around the country, and in the effort to persuade state election officials, secretaries of state, and legislatures to undermine the Constitution. And that's what that Fulton County case gets at. And I think that that is the thing that would really vindicate the rule of law around free and fair elections.
You know, with such a smoking gun piece of evidence as the audio recording of Trump pressuring Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger to find 11,780 votes that didn't exist, why would you imagine this investigation does seem to be languishing so long? Like, what do you presume that DA Fani Willis is still looking to do as we await an indictment?
So I think it goes to the scope. I mean, let's be honest. If this was just a case against Donald Trump, I'm with you. You know, this case could have moved more quickly. But look at who she's hauled before the grand jury. Look at the breadth of evidence that we know from just what we read in the newspaper about what she's looking at. I don't think she's just looking at Donald Trump in one phone call. I think she's looking at the entire apparatus of Republicans at the national level and in the states to submit false slates of electors, to try to interfere with the business of the state in certifying their election results. So I'd expect a bigger case there in terms of breadth of charges and also numbers of defendants than we've seen in either New York or Florida.
Okay, so that's one of those rare instances where this thing taking so long is actually kind of points to a good sign, in the sense that we may see a bigger case than we otherwise would have if it was just Donald Trump and like a single charge.
Yeah, and a case that really vindicates democracy, really vindicates the importance of accurate certification of elections. That's part of democracy.
Now, let's finish off with this. To that point of the scope of these attacks on democracy, election deniers were just elected to Georgia's Republican leadership roles this past week. What kind of harm could they do by virtue of their positions now?
I think we have to assume that in Georgia and elsewhere, election deniers are now the mainstream of the Republican Party, and they can do enormous damage. They can do damage in the way in which elections are administered. They can do damage in the way in which machines are stored and programmed and corrupted. They can do damage in the way in which we don't have enough good election officials to even open and staff polling places. I mean, there's a million ways that the administration of elections can get gummed up. And these election deniers, that's what they're there for. They're not there to make the election run smoothly. They're there to show that the election can't run smoothly.
All right, well, that seems like a good place to stop. So obviously, as soon as we have more news on what Marc and his team are doing, especially as it relates to these redistricting cases in Louisiana, Alabama, Texas, and Georgia, we'll bring a new episode to you. In the meantime, what we can do to support Marc and his team is sign up for Democracy Docket. The link is right here on the screen or in the post description of this video. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
I'm Marc Elias.
This is Democracy Watch.